Open to the book of Genesis. If you want to jump back to Genesis 37, that's probably a good idea because that's where we're going to start. We're going to pick up here. Now, here at Lakeside, we've had this scripture reading plan, and it's in the back if you want a copy of that, if you want to start following along with us. And so far this month, it's a daily Bible reading plan. We've been going through Genesis, we're actually in Exodus a little bit now, and Matthew. And what I want to do is every fourth Sunday p.m., I want to recap something that was in the reading from the past month. Now, I know I've talked to a few of you, and some of you said you're doing other Bible reading plans, and you're doing that kind of thing. That's great. Do that. I don't want to interrupt your flow there, and I think that'd be great to continue with that. But what I want to do is I want to present to you a message from something that is in that plan. So that way, that'll give you the chance, if you haven't read it, maybe go back sometime this week and read that section. If you have read it, then go back and reread it and see what else is there. Because no matter how many times you read these stories, you keep getting more and more out of it. I definitely found that to be true after this reading of Joseph. And we are talking about Joseph. And the lesson is from pit to palace. He had so many different things that happened to him in his life. And this ranges from Genesis 37 all the way to Genesis 50. So by the way, another thing I should probably say at this point is we're not going to read every verse. And we would be here a long time. So I'm just going to try to summarize some of this. We're going to hit some highlights. But there's some things I want to point out to you that I think could be helpful for us to see. And it will be faith building as well. When you see God's plan, from way before the foundations of the earth, God had this plan. And see how it's accomplished through the acts of people, through the lives. It is really, truly amazing. And I want to look at some of those things. I want to focus on those. And some of the connections of Joseph to other characters in the Bible. Not to spoil anything, but Jesus. We're going to see a lot of Jesus foreshadowed in Joseph. So let's think about where Joseph starts. In Genesis 37, we're introduced to Joseph, and we get a little bit of this, and we find out how he gets himself into the pit. And in Genesis 37, we have this story that really starts out with a word that is kind of unfortunate. It's favoritism. We see a lot of favoritism in Joseph's life. Now, it was his father Jacob who got the name Israel. First of all, he had a favorite wife. It's probably not a good idea when you have, let me say that again. Look, I have a favorite wife, all right? The one and only. But it was a different situation, all right? So he had a favorite wife, and his favorite wife had his favorite son. And he had a lot of sons. He had 12 sons. And Joseph was by far the favorite. And everybody knew it, too. Jacob didn't even try to hide it from him. Do you remember what he gave Joseph as a gift? Like that coat, like the tunic. Some says like various colored, multicolored tunic. There's another translation that says like long-sleeved robe, and that's actually probably what it was, a long-sleeved robe. We always think it's like multicolored. Maybe that is. Maybe it is. I won't burst your bubble there. But it was a special coat. And every time, could you just imagine, every time the brothers see Joseph wearing this coat, it's like, there he is again, like, why is he doing this? But there's a few things that happened as well that didn't help out. Some of these dreams, look in Genesis 37, in verse 4, this is where we get, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. But then in verse 5, then Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And he said, listen, come on now. Verse 6, he said to them, please listen to this dream which I have had. Joseph, I don't know if you should be doing that, you know? Like, if you know your brothers hate you and you have this dream that has, like, you were binding sheaves and all of your brothers' sheaves were bowing down to your, like, that's not going to give them a favorable opinion of you. And it wasn't just one dream either. He had two. So he had this one with the sheaves, and then he had another dream where even the sun, moon, and stars bowed down to him. And that really set the brothers on edge. And if you really think about what was happening there, It turned a normal sibling rivalry into something much more violent and much more concerning. Now, favoritism, listen, this tends to run in families. This wasn't a new thing with Jacob favoring Joseph. Because, think about his heritage. Remember Abraham, who he favored? Isaac over Ishmael. And then Isaac and Rebekah, they had different favorite sons. Isaac always liked Esau more. And that always led to problems. And this is no difference. It definitely has some problems here. So we see this happening. But then, when we get to this place where Joseph's brothers are out, and his dad thinks they're in Shechem. That's where his dad sends Joseph to provide for them, to see what's up with them, in verse 12. And Israel said to Joseph, verse 13, "Are your brothers not pasturing here? Come, I will send you them." He's just wanting Joseph to go and check on them. And so he goes to Shechem, and actually, when he gets to Shechem, the brothers aren't there. And another guy said, "Well, I heard them talking about going to Dothan." So they were even further away. Joseph has traveled about 65 miles at this point to get to the brothers. And look at what happens as soon as they see him. Verse 18, when they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come, let us kill him and throw him to one of the pits." So as soon as they saw him coming, and by the way, he was wearing that stupid coat. And it was like just this beacon of hatred. And as soon as they were like, "How can we get rid of him? This is just ridiculous. We try to get away from him. We go 65 miles up the road, and here he is." Well, they get this plot, and they're like, let's kill him. We're going to, and you know how guys are. I'm not saying that I've ever done anything like this. But when you get a group of guys together, they just kind of feed off of each other. Like one gives more boldness to the other, and usually you find yourself in just terrible situations, and you wouldn't have been there alone. Well, I think that's what's happening here. The brothers are kind of helping each other, think about being more bold. But Reuben, the oldest brother, you see that he actually tried to manage things. It's like, no, don't kill him. Just throw him in the pit. Just leave him there. He actually wanted to secretly rescue him. That was his goal, what he was going to try to do. I don't know. Maybe Reuben, he was like, I'm the oldest. I'm more responsible. Wants to get in a good word with his dad. Reuben actually a couple chapters ago in chapter 35 messed up pretty big time. Taking one of his father's concubines. That was not a good idea. And so maybe he's trying to buy back favor. I don't know. But Reuben tries to intervene and says, "Don't kill the boy. Just throw him in this pit." And then when he was in the pit, do you remember what his brother Judah said? Well, why should we just leave him in the pit? Here's some travelers. Let's sell him and get some money. And then after they sell him, do you remember what they did with the coat? They said, "Let's take his coat, rip it up into shreds, dip it into goat's blood, and then we'll present it to our father to see what he says about it." Because they want Jacob to think that Joseph was dead. And so in verse 31 of chapter 37, they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a male goat, dipped the tunic in the blood. They sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it's your son's tunic or not." So a couple things about that. Notice now they did not call Joseph their brother. They called him Jacob's son. It's like, "This son of yours." Kind of reminds you of the prodigal son, like the older brother talking about the prodigal son to his father. It was like, "This son of yours." They didn't think too highly of Joseph. Now something else that's really interesting in here. These boys deceived their father using, one, a goat, and two, part of their brother's clothing. Isn't it slightly ironic, at least? Do you remember what Jacob did earlier in his life? Way, way earlier? When Esau was out trying to kill animals, he deceived his father with two things. Remember what it was? A goat that they turned into stew, and his brother's clothing to pretend to be hairy or whatever. And it's kind of interesting how Jacob gets the same thing coming back to him. You reap what you sow. And that definitely came back to him here. But this is what brings us, that's where Joseph ends up in the pit. But where does he go after he's in the pit? These Ishmaelite travelers take him, and they ended up selling him into slavery in Egypt. And while he's in Egypt, he meets this guy named Potiphar. So Joseph goes from the pit to Potiphar. And while he's at Potiphar's house, and this is Genesis 39, look at this real quick. There's a couple things I want to say about this. When he was there in Potiphar's house, there's a word, and I'm going to try to make this stupidly obvious to you what I'm getting at. But starting in I'm going to read some random words from different verses. In verse 3, towards the end of the verse, the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. Into verse 4, and all that he owned was put in his charge. Verse 5, made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned. At the end of the verse, thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned. So in verse 6, he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge. Do you see what was happening to Joseph? He was getting put in charge of all kinds of stuff. And God was very, very much so blessing him in Potiphar's house. And he was blessing Joseph so much that the blessing sort of extended to Potiphar himself. So this teaches us a couple things. One, that God is with you no matter where you are. Joseph was so far away from his family, so far away from his homeland, but God was there with him and he was blessing him. But also, this shows you God is faithful to his promise. You remember in Genesis 12, the first time God makes a promise to Abraham? He says all kinds of stuff, but he says one thing in particular, I will bless those that bless you. And it seems like here, this is an extension of that. Potiphar is blessing Joseph by putting him in charge of things, so God is blessing Potiphar on his behalf as well. But we see that major success. But you know what happens next, though, right, at Potiphar's house. There is this huge temptation that pops up. Now, I skipped over chapter 38 completely because this has nothing to do with Joseph. It was about Judah. And it was about Judah's downfall. He succumbed to some sins. It was a terrible situation, what happened there with Judah. I think it's there, though, to show you the connection of how Judah dealt with temptation, which wasn't good, compared to how Joseph dealt with temptation, which was really good. And we could learn a lot from the way that Joseph dealt with temptation. Now, you remember the temptation there. Potiphar's wife asking him to lie with her and all of that. We're not going to go through all those details, but I want you just to consider, why would it have been easy for Joseph to give in to that temptation? And why is it that we so easily give in to temptations sometimes? So think about Joseph's situation in particular. So, one, he might think, well, nobody's going to know. He's so far away from home that his family's not going to find out. Obviously, they think he's dead. So why does it matter? He's so far from home, it doesn't even, and it's only going to be between him and her. I mean, that last time that she grabbed him, they were in the house completely alone. Like, nobody's going to find out. So if nobody's going to find out, I guess it's okay. It doesn't matter. On top of that, after everything that he's been through, who would blame him? Which leads to this. It's only natural. You know, God's the one that gave him these feelings and hormones and all of this. And so if you feel a temptation, isn't it kind of God's fault that he goes through with it? And listen, sometimes you'll hear people today say things like, well, God made me this way, and so I have to do this. Do you, though? Like, our temptations do not define us. That's not what makes us who we are. Like, we're able to say no to our temptations. So remember that. But he could have definitely used that as an excuse. And my goodness, was she persistent. She said this day after day. Verse 10, as she spoke to Joseph, day after day. He did not listen. Now, I don't know how provocative she was being, just what in all that entailed and what was going on. But I do know that sin can totally wear us down. I mean, when we have something that's presented to us over and over and it's in our face and we just don't know how to deal with this, that could break the best of us. And so what happens sometimes is maybe you get this mindset of, well, this temptation just keeps coming. Maybe I should just give in once and for all, just get it over with, so it's out of my system, and I'll be done with it completely. Is that how it works? Like, would you say if someone was like had a problem with drugs or something, and it's like, well, I might as well just take all of these drugs so I never want them anymore? No, like that's how you get addicted. Like you just keep wanting more and more. It never ends. You will not defeat temptation by giving in to temptation. That just opens the door for more temptation. So it doesn't matter your thoughts there. Like we can't just give in to that. Another thing to consider, she's kind of his boss, right? Potiphar is the one in charge of the house, so in a way, he has to listen to her. She's telling me to do this. I got to do it. So maybe he could have used that as an excuse. We know he didn't, but that's what he could have said. No matter what the excuse is, if we want to do wrong, if there's sin in front of us and we kind of want to give in, the devil will find a way to make it appealing to us, and he'll give us plenty of opportunities to give in. There was a lot of reasons that Joseph could have said yes and had given in, but he didn't. So let's think about why he didn't. What are some of the things that helped him to resist? How was he able to do that? Well, first of all, because he knows God. Because he says, how could I do this thing and sin against God? He doesn't come out and say, well, I don't know, like really, we could get caught, and that would be really bad, wouldn't it? Like, that's not what he says. He says, how can I do this great thing and sin against the Lord? Like, I can't do that. That's not going to work out. If he would have tried to argue in other ways, or maybe we'll get caught, the devil's really good at making you think that you're never going to get caught. Or whatever way that we try to argue, he will try to present a way that makes us think that we cannot be caught. He also did this. He set clear boundaries. I think this is really important. In verse 10, we read this a second ago. He spoke to Joseph day after day. He would not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. It wasn't just like the ultimate temptation of adultery. It was even, he would not even lie next to her. Like just lie down next to her. What would have been wrong with that? You know, is it wrong to lie next to someone? Well, it could be very unwise, right? If there's a certain temptation that is maybe that you struggle with, that you deal with, is our goal to try to get as close to that temptation as we can without actually giving in? Now, obviously not. And so Joseph set clear boundaries. I'm not even going to get into any kind of situation where that is even going to be a possibility. You know, sometimes, so I use this sometimes when I'm talking to like younger people who are dating or something. It's like, you know, there are some things that you could do as a couple that, you know, technically they aren't wrong, like laying next to each other to watch a movie or something, or covering up with the same blanket, or just being alone somewhere. Maybe in and of themselves, those things aren't wrong. But where does that lead you? Is that a wise situation to put yourself in? I think Joseph was able to set clear boundaries to make sure that none of that happened, that it was not going to be something that would happen. He also mentions that he respects Potiphar. He said, Potiphar put me in charge of all of this stuff. You know, how can I do it? The one thing that he's withheld from me is you, and you know, you're his wife. I can't do that. And so he shows great respect for Potiphar. A lot of times with sins like this, especially, you're only thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about other people. And so just having that mentality of, I'm not going to do this because this will be a sin, not only against God, but against your husband. And so maybe we need to think about that sometimes as well. The person that we're committing the sin with, what's that going to do for their husband or wife or future husband, future wife, or whatever. The language that he used was also really impressive. He called sin exactly what it was. He called it a great evil. How can I do this great evil? I think sometimes what the world does is tries to make us think about sin in a different light. If I can use a different word for sin, maybe it's not going to be so bad. There's all kinds of examples for this. I'll just use this one because we're pretty familiar with it. But it makes a big difference to say, I am going to terminate a pregnancy versus I am going to murder a child. You see the difference there, and how one could be easier for people to fall into that trap. And this works for all sin. We have to call sin, sin, because that's what it is. It's a great evil against God, and it's something that we need to stay away from completely. Goes into how he said, no, I'm not going to do it. He just refused. And if you notice carefully in the text, what it says in verse 8, after that she said, lie with me, but he refused and said to his master's wife. And so he refused first and then gave the reasoning. I think that's important, because we need to make sure that people know where we stand. If they want us to sin in some way, or if there's some kind of temptation, we just got to be willing to say, no, I'm not going to do it. Then give reasonings, sure. But we need to have that commitment first. And Joseph definitely had that commitment. He said, I am not going to do this. Absolutely no wiggle room at all. I mean, Potiphar's wife knew exactly where Joseph stood on this matter. He never gave her a sliver of hope that he was going to give in. It was like, no, I'm just ultimately not going to do that. And this might make you think of passages like Romans 13:14. This is a really good passage to consider along these lines, talking about making provisions of the flesh. What the Bible says is, put on the Lord Jesus Christ. Make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. If we know that there's a sin, and we know that we're going to be tempted with something, stay away from that as far as possible. If there's a way you can get yourself out of the situation, if there's something that you have to remove from your life in order to avoid that completely, what did Jesus say about it? You remember? Like, if your hand causes you to sin, what should you do? Cut it off. Get rid of it. What about your eye? Cut it out. Get rid of it. Because it's better to enter into heaven maimed and wounded than to enter in hell with all of your body parts. Some of you might be familiar with the movie Fireproof. And it's an interesting story, and there's some good parts to this. So you have someone who was really struggling with a particular sin issue. It had to do with his use of a computer. And there's a scene in the movie where he takes that computer and he takes it outside, busts it up, and throws it away, says, I'm done. And that, I think, embodies making no provision for the flesh. Making sure that whatever the sin that I'm tempted with, I'm going to get rid of that. It's not worth going back into sin, being tempted. I need to stay as far away from that as possible. Tell you, I'll just make a brief comment about this. Maybe we need to talk about this more at some point. Cell phones, guys, man. There's so many things that mobile phones, that just being able to access so many things all at once, that can be a temptation. And so we have to be careful how we use this. Just like anything, though, if we know that we're going to be tempted in a situation, it's better try to stay away from the situation as much as possible, whatever we can do to get out. And in Joseph's case, it was better to lose a good coat than a good character, right? Because he left that coat with Potiphar's wife. Now, this is really interesting to me. You know, this is the second coat that Joseph has lost. First was the multicolored one, and yeah. So I don't know if that's important or not, but it was just interesting. Sometimes when we do the right thing, though, bad things happen, and we have to deal with doing right. Can you imagine what Joseph was going through? With, number one, the rumors that were going around because of what Potiphar's wife was saying, and two, just the confusion that Joseph had to be experiencing and going through. First, he got sold into slavery by his brothers, thrown into this pit, and then now he ends up in Egypt. Now he's falsely accused by Mrs. Potiphar because of this temptation, and he's thrown into prison again. And so, what is going on? There's a lot of just negative things that's happening here. And sometimes if this happens, and I know I've felt this before, if bad things are happening, sometimes we think, well, what's the use? Why do I keep trying to do the right thing if bad things keep happening? And it seems like the more right things that I do, how hard was it to stand up to that temptation? And now he's in prison. Like, there's so many just terrible things that are happening. Is it worth it to do the right thing when we're going through all of this? I tell you, reading through this account again made me think, when you read of what's happening to Joseph in this moment, it doesn't really surprise us. And you know why? We know the rest of the story. We know where he's going to end up, and we know what's going to happen, and we see God's ultimate plan there. And so this is kind of easy for us to read, because even though there's some terrible things happening now, it's like, but Joseph, just wait. You don't know how much better it's going to be. Did Joseph know that? Like, how long was he in this situation? Now, I don't know the exact timing. He was sold into slavery when he was 17. And he didn't leave prison until he was 30. So there were 13 years, at least, when he was in this, from Potiphar's place to the prison, and we don't know the exact timing there, but I'm sure a lot of us, if I was in that situation, what would I be thinking? Like, there's no end in sight. There's nothing for Joseph to see, to hold on to be like, well, it's going to get better. Is it? Is it really? Like, how is it going to get better? I tell you, he held on for 13 years when things look so bad. I get frustrated when I'm 13 days into I get frustrated in 13 seconds into a problem. And here Joseph is, and he doesn't know if things are going to turn out well or not. But he is still doing the right thing. Now, what would we do? I don't know. I'm glad I'm not in that situation. But God tells us what happens for us and what we have to look forward to. And we see God's plan in this. He was perfecting Joseph. He was bringing about his ultimate plan to bring his people into Egypt, to protect them, to grow them into a nation. What we have to do is we can't worry about what God's doing because we don't understand what he's doing anyway. And so what we need to do is just the next right thing. Whatever that we can physically do ourselves to accomplish the Lord's will. That's what we need to be doing. God's going to take care of the rest. Joseph was in the pit. He went to Potiphar's house. Now he's in prison. And you remember what happened when he was in prison, right? In Genesis 40 and 41, there's this series of dreams. And there's a few dreamers that he interacts with. There's this cupbearer and there's a baker. And there's some very similar things that happen in the dreams that these guys have. One thing, there's a phrase that's used for both of them. And Joseph says, Pharaoh is going to lift up your head. But that doesn't mean the same thing for both of them. One of them, he says, he's going to lift up your head and restore you to your position. And the other one, he says, he's going to lift up your head and remove it from your body by hanging you. That's much different. Do you remember which one is which? The cupbearer or the baker? Which one got to go back to his position and which one didn't? I've struggled with trying to remember which one this was for a while. Here's something that I've learned that can help with that. Cupbearer. What kind of things do cupbearers normally work with? What's like the substance that they usually have in the cup? Probably like wine, fruit of the vine, maybe. Bakers. What do they deal with a lot? Bread. That's what bakers do. So fruit of the vine and bread. Does that sound familiar at all, by the way? Maybe something that we do. In the Lord's Supper, the relationship between what the bread does and what the fruit of the vine does, which one represents life? It's, the fruit of the vine, because that's the blood of Jesus that provides life for us. And so the cupbearer, he was the one that was granted life. The baker was the one who was put to death. Now, you probably remember what happened at the end of that. Joseph said, now, cupbearer, when you get back into Pharaoh's presence, remind him of what happened to me and tell him all about this because he'll let me go and it'll be great. Did the cupbearer remember? Absolutely not. At the end of chapter 41, chapter 40, verse 23 tells us in a couple different ways. Chapter 40, verse 23, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And so there's no confusion there. He totally forgot. He just didn't remember to bring it up. But then it says 2 years pass, and after 2 full years, Pharaoh has a dream. He actually has 2 dreams. And then the cupbearer says, hey, I remember this guy. He helped out. you need to bring him in, and he needs to talk to you. And so Pharaoh brings in Joseph. You can see that in chapter 41, verse 14. He calls for Joseph. They clean Joseph up, bring him up into Pharaoh's presence, and he said, I heard that you can tell me what these dreams mean. Well, in verse 16, Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And so still, even in this position, Joseph is pointing to God and saying it's God who's doing this. He's still faithful to the Lord, which is really, really good to see. But the two dreams were pretty bizarre, but you remember what this means. There's going to be 7 years of plenty. You're going to have a lot of crops, and then you're going to have 7 years of famine. And 7 years of famine are going to be so bad, you need to stock up on all your food in these first 7 years to prepare for the second 7 years. And because of this, what does Pharaoh do for Joseph? He elevates him to the highest position possible. So Joseph, let's track this so far. He started in the pit. Then he went to Potiphar's house. Now he's in prison. But now he's in the palace. And he goes through this whole process of getting to the second in command in the land of Egypt. He was second only to Pharaoh. This was really the highest position that Pharaoh could give him. He's not going to give him his own, position as Pharaoh, but he's like, I don't know, the prime minister or something. He is like really important to the whole country. And so he says, Joseph, you're in charge of all this. Figure it out, make it happen. And Joseph does, and God is with him. Now, throughout this, we have those visitations from his brothers. And this is where it really get down into it. So the first time that his brothers come to visit, there were 10 of them. And they come, they're before Joseph. They don't recognize him. Joseph knows who they are. And he says, you guys are spies. And he just interrogates them. I think he's testing them for many reasons. I'll tell you that in a second. But he interrogates them, asks about their family, figures out Benjamin is still alive, and he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold one of you in prison until the rest of you come back, and you need to bring Benjamin here so I can verify that what you said was true. I really honestly think Joseph was just trying to rescue Benjamin from the family. He didn't know if they had repented yet or not, and so he was just looking for a way to get Benjamin separated from the others. And if you read that story, if you read these chapters with that in mind, it changes the way you look at some things. I think it's helpful. But when he does that, he ends up keeping Simeon. He finds out that Reuben actually wanted to keep him alive. I don't think he knew that before. I think that's why he didn't keep Reuben. He keeps Simeon instead. And he sends the others home. And when they got home, they realized, oh no, we still have our silver in our bags. Everything about this situation was spooky. Now, eventually, they do come back and they bring Benjamin. And so now we have all of the brothers there. Joseph invites them to this big feast, and he puts them in order from oldest to youngest. And they're looking around like, how does he know that? That is so weird. And then he gives Benjamin like 5 times the amount of food as everyone else. I think, again, trying to see what are the brothers going to say about this when he's shown favoritism. And after this, he sends him home, but he does the little thing where he puts the silver cup in Benjamin's sack and has his servant go and has him bring him back. And he's making them think that he's going to keep Benjamin in prison. He's like, y'all can go, but I'm keeping this one. Do you remember which brother it was that stood up and said, no, don't do that? It was Judah. And that's interesting for a couple reasons. Do you remember whose idea it was to sell him into slavery? It was Judah. And now Judah is stepping up and saying, look, I'll take his punishment. I will go and become a slave in his place. You don't want to do this. And I think that this reveals that Judah's heart has changed and had true repentance. It's at this point where he reveals himself to his brothers. And so I think that was applicable. Maybe we need to think about this as well. Can you think of anyone else who was from the tribe of Judah that offered himself as a sacrifice to stand in the place for other people? It's Jesus. Jesus did that. And so Judah, I think, was foreshadowing Jesus in some of this. And so that was an interesting turn of events here. And we have that big reveal. And you see Joseph offers so much forgiveness. Thanks for the reading of chapter 45, 1 through 8. That's the reveal, and Joseph is offering forgiveness and reconciliation to his brothers. Joseph was not the one who, if we really think about it, Joseph was the one who was wronged. And he was the one who was reaching out first to mend this relationship. Kind of what Jesus does too, right? Offers forgiveness and this reconciliation. You see a lot of really good qualities in Joseph. But he also mentioned the providence of God. It's like, it wasn't you guys who did this. It was God. God was orchestrating this from the very beginning. He even repeats that, by the way, in chapter 50. Like, after his father dies, the brothers get scared and say, well, he might try to kill me now. No, but he said in chapter 50, verse 19, Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. God is able to turn even evil things that are happening into good, because God has a bigger purpose than what we have. And his will will be accomplished no matter if we are actively trying to help him or actively working against him. God's will is going to be accomplished. This might remind you of Romans chapter 8, verse 28. All things work together for the good, for those who love the Lord. This is one of those situations where that happened. And so if this can happen for Joseph, and we know that God saw all this beforehand, we know for a fact he can do the same thing for us. He can cause things to work out for the good. No matter how bad it is, no matter how many situations we find ourselves in, God can provide, and God has a way of getting us out. And we need to remember that our job, again, stay faithful to the Lord, and he'll see us through. I do, real quick, want to show you one more thing, and then I'll let you all go. But this connection that we see between Joseph and Jesus is kind of astounding. And I want to show you, and I only picked a few. You could probably go and read this story and think about it and come up with even more. But how many times do we see Jesus being foreshadowed in what Joseph was going through and what Joseph did? This happens a lot in the Old Testament. If you open up the Old Testament and read through with that mindset, what am I seeing that represents Jesus? I think this can help build our faith, for one, and understand, man, God authored such a complex, amazing book. And we see all of these lessons. But think about this. Jesus and Joseph. Both of them are called the beloved son of the Father. That one's pretty easy. We got that one. They both testified against sin and were hated for it. Joseph, with his brothers, talking about what they shouldn't do, he gave a bad report to his father, Jacob, and they didn't like it. Jesus, the same way, obviously. They were sent away on a mission, sent far away, to provide for their brothers. That's what Jesus did, and Joseph as well, 65 miles. He went a long way. They were plotted against in hopes of killing. Actually, there's some of your Bibles might have like a cross-reference when Joseph's brothers were talking about killing him to some of the passages where the Jews were plotting to kill Jesus. Same thing. Delivered into the hands of strangers by jealousy. They were jealous of Joseph, so delivered into the hands of strangers. Same thing with Jesus. Sold for pieces of silver. Joseph was sold for 20 pieces. Jesus was sold for 30 pieces. Inflation probably changed those numbers. But it was silver, and they were paid for. Was tempted but didn't yield. This is really interesting. Joseph is really one of the only, there's not many characters in the Bible where we don't see a single sin recorded for them. Not saying that Joseph was perfect, but at least we don't have that recorded. Even Abraham, Moses, David, you know some of their major failings because the Bible doesn't shy away from that. Joseph, when he was put into that temptation, didn't yield. Same thing with Jesus. He had the Spirit of God. They both did. Were wrongfully accused. Got punished for things they didn't deserve. 2 were punished with him, and 1 was restored. Joseph, the baker, cupbearer, so was punished with 2 people. 1 of them was restored to their position, and the other was not. Same thing with Jesus, crucified with 2 thieves, remember? And 1 of them was restored, and the other wasn't. They were both acknowledged to be Savior. They actually called Joseph Savior in the land because of what he did and provided. Everybody has to get their bread through them. Christ more spiritually speaking. They freely forgave their enemies. This one's kind of weird, so you might not like this. I do, though. After death. So after Joseph died, was presumed dead, he was first, the first visitation was with 10 brothers, and then the second, they brought Benjamin, so there was 11. Jesus, when he first appeared to his disciples after death, remember there was one disciple who wasn't there? And there was only 10 of them. It was Thomas. He wasn't there. But then the second time he comes, like, there it was. I don't know if that one's important, but it was interesting. And in his first coming was rejected. The brothers didn't like Joseph the first time. The second time, they bow to him. Same thing with Jesus. The first time that he came, he was rejected, ultimately killed. But you know what's said about his second coming? Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess. And that's just a few of these things. You could probably find a lot more. But I just wanted to show you how important it is to read through and to study the Bible, keeping in mind the whole purpose of God. This story of Joseph reveals a lot to us about God himself, about how much he cares about us, about how much he is able to preserve his promises. Now, the promises he made through Abraham of a great nation, a lot of this was fulfilled because Joseph allowed it to be where the people came into Egypt and they were able to multiply there. There's so many things that